When you go to a store to buy something, and the item is priced at $170, you know that price is likely inflated. It's higher than your maximum acceptable price of $150. You understand that the store owner also has a minimum acceptable price. Through bargaining, you aim to not only bring the price down to $150, but also to get it as close as possible to the owner's minimum price. The closer you get, the more you save. Conversely, the owner wants the price as close to your maximum as possible to maximize profit. You both are aware of this dynamic, but neither of you knows the other's actual bottom line. The negotiation begins, with each of you hiding your true limits and throwing out false ones, bluffing to make the other believe these are your real boundaries. Eventually, you both threaten to walk away from the deal, a lose-lose situation where you don't get the item, and the owner doesn't make a sale. Yet, you both act indifferent to this potential outcome, using it as leverage. At this point, you slowly turn and walk towards the door. It's the most tense and crucial moment. You start to regret it. The owner's price is acceptable. You hesitate, wondering if you should turn back. The owner also regrets, thinking making less is better than making nothing. He hesitates, wondering if he should call you back. With each step you take, the atmosphere grows more intense. You both struggle between wanting to compromise and hoping the other will give in first. This is the dilemma faced by Kennedy and Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba, an island nation located just off the coast of the United States, was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492. For the next 400 years, it remained a Spanish colony until the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Following Spain's defeat, Cuba was ceded to the United States, which subsequently propped up a series of puppet governments and continued to interfere in the island's internal affairs and commerce. In 1956, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara formed a revolutionary organization with the slogan "A Cuba for Cubans." At its lowest point, the group consisted of just 12 people and 7 rifles. The Cuban government at the time even deployed its air force to quash the rebellion. However, Castro and his followers ultimately succeeded in toppling the puppet government and establishing a revolutionary regime. Contrary to popular belief, Cuba was not initially a socialist nation. Castro, who had no ties to the Soviet Union and little understanding of communism, even attempted to maintain diplomatic relations with the United States. However, Cuba's nationalization reforms sparked American discontent, and the U.S. government grew concerned that the new, independent Cuban regime would undermine its influence in Latin America. In response, the U.S. responded by imposing economic sanctions and supporting anti-government forces in an attempt to overthrow Castro's government. It was at this moment that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sensed an opportunity. The Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union had reached a boiling point, with the U.S. deploying nuclear missiles in Turkey, significantly reducing the Soviet Union's warning time in the event of an attack. Khrushchev was eager to find a foothold in the Americas and establish a nuclear deterrent against the U.S. The two sides quickly formed an alliance, with the Soviet Union providing significant economic and military aid to Cuba, while Cuba, in turn, allowed Soviet troops and nuclear weapons to secretly enter the island. In 1961, Cuba officially became a socialist nation, effectively becoming a red thorn in the side of the United States. On October 15, 1962, US U-2 spy planes discovered the extensive deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba, which could easily target Washington with a warning time of less than 5 minutes. When these photographs were presented to Kennedy, all the American officials present felt a strong sense of unease. Kennedy quickly convened a meeting to discuss response measures. including diplomatic negotiations, a naval blockade of Cuba, or a direct air strike and invasion by the U.S. military. The military hardliners believed that a blockade was too weak, with General LeMay stating that the Soviets were digging graves in the U.S.'s backyard and advocating for immediate air strikes, followed by a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Kennedy managed to restrain the military hardliners and decided to proceed with the blockade first. On October 22, Kennedy delivered a televised speech announcing the naval blockade of Cuba and demanding the withdrawal of the Soviet missiles. On October 23, Khrushchev declared that the Soviet Union would not accept the blockade and warned that any U.S. invasion of Cuba would result in severe Soviet retaliation. Both sides' global military forces went on high alert. On October 24, the U.S. deployed 68 Air Force squadrons, 8 aircraft carriers, and 90 warships to blockade the entire Cuban Sea area. On the same day, a Soviet freighter crossed the blockade line, and the U.S. Navy ordered it to stop and undergo inspection. However, without direct orders from Kennedy, the Navy could not open fire and had to abandon the interception. Khrushchev, fearing that Soviet weapons might be seized by the Americans, analyzed the situation and recalled most of the ships carrying Soviet military equipment, slightly easing the tensions. During the same day's United Nations Security Council meeting, the U.S. ambassador and the Soviet ambassador engaged in a heated exchange. The U.S. presented photographs of the Soviet missile launch sites for the first time, gaining an advantage in public opinion. On October 26, Khrushchev's first handwritten letter arrived at Kennedy's desk, suggesting that if the U.S. guaranteed not to invade Cuba, the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles. However, simultaneously, Soviet forces did not halt their construction, but instead accelerated the deployment of missiles in Cuba. This move sparked strong dissatisfaction among U.S. military officials, who believed the Soviets were pretending to negotiate while buying time to deploy more missiles. The military advocated for an immediate air strike as a warning. Kennedy faced a difficult decision, but ultimately chose to continue negotiations and avoid invading Cuba for the time being. October 27th, the longest day in human history. Deep in the waters off the coast of Cuba, a Soviet B-59 submarine carrying nuclear torpedoes had been submerged for a week. The air inside the vessel was thick with the stench of sweat and stale air, and the crew was running low on food and water. The temperature was sweltering, and the crew's physical and mental limits were being pushed to the breaking point. Just then, the U.S. Navy discovered the submarine and, unaware that it was carrying nuclear torpedoes, dropped training depth charges to force it to surface. The charges were meant to be a warning, not an attack, but the Soviets had never seen this type of warning before and assumed they were under attack. The Third World War had almost begun. Before setting sail, the Soviet military had authorized its troops to use nuclear weapons if they were attacked and unable to contact Moscow. The B-59 submarine was in a situation where it couldn't contact Moscow, and the crew believed they were under attack. The captain decided to launch a nuclear torpedo. According to protocol, the launch required the agreement of the 3 highest-ranking officers on board: the captain, the political commissar, and the deputy captain. The captain and the commissar agreed, but the deputy captain, Vasily Arkhipov, hesitated. Arkhipov knew that if the submarine didn't launch the nuclear torpedo, it would have to surface, which would mean surrender. The crew might be taken prisoner, and the submarine could be seized by the Americans. At this critical moment, Arkhipov stood firm and refused to agree to the launch. The submarine eventually surfaced, and instead of being met with gunfire, it was greeted with music. Kennedy had instructed the U.S. Navy to allow the submarine to return to the Soviet Union unharmed if it surfaced. Just as one crisis was averted, another erupted. A USU two spy plane flying over Cuba was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile, killing the pilot. This was the first casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the news reached the U.S. Air Force Command Center, the military took a hardline stance, believing that the Soviets were not interested in negotiations. The Air Force decided to launch a strike against the Soviet missile sites in Cuba, but this plan had to be approved by Kennedy. After careful consideration, Kennedy vetoed the plan. The rift between the military and the president had grown too wide, with the military believing that Kennedy was weak and incompetent, and the president accusing the military of being reckless and willing to send other people's sons to war. Meanwhile, Khrushchev's second letter arrived at the White House, demanding that the U.S. withdraw its missiles from Turkey. The U.S. military continued to pressure Kennedy, pointing out that the Soviet missile sites in Cuba would be fully operational by the 29th, and that the U.S. had to act first. Kennedy was caught between the military's pressure and the unpredictable actions of the Soviets. He was at the most difficult moment of his life. The U.S. and Soviet embassies were burning their secret documents, and the nation was conducting large-scale air raid drills. The doomsday clock had reached its closest point to midnight, and everyone believed that war was inevitable. The world held its breath, watching Kennedy and Khrushchev's every move. At the time, Kennedy was just 45 years old, which was quite young for a president. Previously, he and Khrushchev had only met once at the Vienna summit. During their meeting, they discussed whaling ships and the dog that the Soviet Union had sent into space. After returning to the United States, Kennedy received a model of the whaling ship and a puppy from the space dog's litter, sent by Khrushchev. Surprised and grateful, Kennedy wrote a thank you note, and they began exchanging letters. The whaling ship model now sits on his desk, and the puppy has been raised by his children. They wrote many letters to each other, but they never asked each other the question that lingered in their minds. If one day fate pushed them to the brink of nuclear war, with the lives of billions in their hands, would they press the button? We may never know what ultimately convinced Kennedy to trust Khrushchev, but he chose to believe that Khrushchev would not press the button. Kennedy had his brother meet with the Soviet ambassador to assure him that the U.S. would not invade Cuba and that the U.S. would secretly dismantle its missiles in Turkey within 6 months. Kennedy even revealed the U.S. military's attack plan for the 29th, urging the Soviets to act quickly. Meanwhile, in the Kremlin, Khrushchev was furious because Soviet forces had shot down a U.S. reconnaissance plane. This attack was ordered by a temporary stand-in general without Khrushchev's authorization. Khrushchev immediately ordered that no Soviet soldier could fire a single shot without his permission. The Soviet ambassador delivered Kennedy's message to Khrushchev, who was overjoyed. Without waiting for a formal response, he announced over the radio that the Soviet Union would withdraw its missiles. On the other side, Kennedy had just postponed the military's plans by another week. To avoid embarrassing U.S. allies, and for propaganda purposes, the U.S. withdrawal from Turkey was delayed and done in secret, making it appear as though the U.S. had won the crisis. The public believed that Kennedy had forced the Soviet Union to back down through sheer military might. In reality, through deploying and removing missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union achieved its strategic goal of getting the U.S. to withdraw missiles from Turkey. Kennedy saved face, and Khrushchev got what he wanted, making it a relatively perfect outcome. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, both nations began considering how to prevent similar crises. A hotline was established between Washington and Moscow to allow direct communication between the leaders. Experts extensively analyzed the Cuban Missile Crisis, leading to further development of nuclear deterrence theory and improvements in nuclear weapon launch procedures. That it's been 59 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I see it as a warning that has continually reminded us how close we came to the destruction of civilization. Being cautious is not a bad thing. It's those who insist on driving full speed ahead without changing course, willing to take the world down with them, who deserve condemnation. Kennedy and Khrushchev were complex individuals, but during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they both showed extraordinary restraint and patience, pulling the world back from the brink of nuclear war. Thaddeus Kennedy once quoted Khrushchev in a speech, "In the next war, the survivors will envy the dead." That concludes the main content of this episode. We hope you enjoyed it and will like, subscribe, and share. Your support is our greatest motivation.